Hi, everybody. I'm so glad that you came in person today, and welcome to all of you. I'm sure a larger number that are viewing online today. Oh, we're already at 100, so sounds great. I'm Pat Falcone. I'm the lab's Deputy Director for Science and Technology. I'm delighted to be partnering today with our Data Science Institute in bringing a terrifically distinguished speaker today for this colloquium. We're so delighted to welcome Professor Stuart Russell to Livermore to talk today on general AI safety. I think everyone who's interested in this topic has come across Professor Russell's work, if only in the textbook or the video Slaughterbots and its accompanying newest one, which I hadn't known about till I looked it back up. But the first one, I have to say, was quite chilling and impactful for me. He is a professor at the University of California at Berkeley, director of the Center for Human Compatible AI, director of the Kavli Center for Ethics, Science, and the Public. He's won many prizes and distinctions, and you know, as we, as a laboratory, are trying to both apply AI in our science and research, but also, as you know, through the AI Edge program, to understand how we can use AI to make all of our operations and productivity overall better. The thought of having a deep understanding of AI safety, AI security is really important, and we're so grateful to have one of the world's experts be right here with us in person. And thank you very much, Professor Russell.
Thanks, Pat. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you all for coming. So I'm going to just begin by making some what I hope are obvious points. Let me also apologize to those of you who heard my talk a few months ago at the previous seminar that was held here on AI safety, because it's going to be a quite similar talk, but there'll be a lot more opportunity to have questions, and I think that'll be the most valuable part of this. So the first important point is that AI safety does not mean safety of exactly today's commercially available AI systems. We have to think about what's coming down the line. And just as many other branches of science and engineering have gone far beyond their feeble roots to have huge impacts on the world, AI is on the way to doing that. And if we don't plan for AI systems that exceed human capabilities, we're likely to be caught unawares when they do. So this seems to me absolutely essential to think about what's coming down the line. The timeline we can talk about later, but the inevitability, I think, is pretty high. And I hope we all agree that we would like humans to remain in control of our civilization and our future. There are those who would be quite happy to have humans replaced by AI systems completely, that we simply don't exist anymore because the AI systems are more intelligent, so they deserve to own the world. I don't agree with that viewpoint. We can discuss that too. So given those 2 points, it seems just unavoidable that we have to have AI systems that we can absolutely rely on, that are provably beneficial to humans. And that means, I think, getting away from a phrase that we hear a lot, making AI safe. Making AI safe really means making AI systems, and then maybe we'll think a little bit about safety afterwards, which is what we did with the internet. That didn't work out so well, right? And I think, to its credit, although I'm not really an expert on the early history of nuclear power, I think the early development of nuclear power had safety as a constraint, right? That we're making nuclear reactors that are safe by design. I know that Leo Szilard, when he thought about the nuclear chain reaction, immediately thought about how to have a negative feedback moderation control system so that it could remain subcritical, right? So it was right there from the very beginning of the nuclear energy that safety was intrinsic to what they were doing. And that has not been the case for AI at all. The UK AI Safety Institute just did safety testing of the 4 leading AI models, and the summary of their report says that it was either trivially easy to remove all the safety guardrails, or we didn't even have to do that because the systems just answered the questions they weren't supposed to answer. Another important point I want to make is I want to try as much as possible to defuse what the media are calling, a smackdown, a schism, whatever you want to call it, between people who are concerned about harms that are already occurring, whether that's disinformation or discrimination, and harms that may occur in the future, which relate more to loss of human control. These harms are really a continuum, and they all arise from an inability to make AI systems that are provably beneficial. And you can see exactly how, if you don't know how to do that, your systems might discriminate. If the systems don't know that what they're doing is harmful, they're quite happy to generate disinformation or advise you on how to build a biological weapon or anything else. So I think if we can try to eliminate that supposed dichotomy, we will be better off. Another reason that I think the making AI safe mentality is not going to work is that if you start with a system that's super intelligent, that wants to do the wrong thing, and then you try to prevent it from doing the wrong thing, you're probably going to lose, right? And in the book Human Compatible, I called this the loophole principle, drawing on 6,000 years of our attempts to write taxation law. So for 6,000 years, we've had highly motivated governments and emperors and kings trying to get their citizens and now corporations to pay their taxes. And for 6,000 years, we failed because the people who are supposed to pay the taxes and the corporations don't want to pay their taxes, and they can afford very, very expensive lawyers to outwit the governments, or they can even simply buy the governments and get the governments to change the tax law to suit them. And so the same reasoning applies to any attempt to get a misaligned AI system to behave in ways that we are happy with. So the only way this is going to work is if the AI systems want to pay their taxes, right? And so that's the goal. And all of these considerations mean that AI has to become much more like those engineering disciplines that take safety as job one, as they often call it, but who view an unsafe airplane or an unsafe nuclear power station as simply an abomination, right? You've failed. You're just not a good nuclear engineer. You're not a good airplane designer if your systems are unsafe. But that consideration doesn't occur in AI. If you build an AI system that scores highly on the bar exam, you're a good AI researcher, regardless of what bad things that system does. And so that mindset has got to change. My friend Ed Morse, who's a nuclear engineer at Berkeley, told me that he studied the requirements placed on nuclear plant operators to ensure safety by the regulatory commissions, originally I think the AEC and then the NRC. And he plotted a graph of the mass of paperwork on the y-axis and the mass of the nuclear power station on the x-axis. Literally. And it's quite linear. And anyone want to have a guess how many kilograms of paper per kilogram of nuclear power station? Right. 7. 7 kilograms of paper per kilogram of nuclear power station. Right? And just think of that. Right? That's a testament to how dedicated they were to safety and how seriously they took this obligation, both on the regulatory side and on the engineering side. What do we do now with AI systems? You know, we hire 3 people for a week, and they do some testing, and they say, yep, failed all the tests, and we release it anyway. Right? It's completely incomparable, and that's got to change. All right, so let's start talking about AI. AI is making intelligent machines. The standard model for what that has meant is borrowed from economics and philosophy, this idea of rational behavior, that your actions can be expected to achieve your objectives. So that's what we did for most of the history of AI. We built objective maximizing machinery of various kinds. And so did control theory, so did economics, so did statistics, so did operations research. It's all the same basic model. And it works pretty well in restricted circumstances where you can be sure, for example, in chess, that the objective is right. The objective of winning the game is very straightforward, perfectly definable. Unlike control theory and operations and research, AI is aiming for a very ambitious type of optimizing system, if you like, something that can exceed human capabilities to achieve objectives across the board. So anything that humans can do that's at least relevant here, AI systems will be able to learn to do it better very quickly. So it used to be, even 5 years ago, no one had a slide like this. Have we succeeded? Because it was obvious we hadn't succeeded. It would be like, in 1928, saying, have we reached the moon yet? Of course we haven't reached the moon. What are you talking about? But a few months ago, Peter Norvig, the co-author on my textbook, published a paper saying that we have succeeded. That the systems we have now are general purpose AI in the sense that I just defined it. But very much still in the early days, right? And the analogy he used is that the Wright brothers have invented, built, and flown their airplane. And from then on, it's just a question of making it bigger and faster and adding more comfortable seats and a better selection of drinks. And, it's not an implausible argument. And in fact, I think a lot of the money being invested, which I'll talk about later, is betting on that. That all we really need to do is scale up, improve some of the interface aspects, and we will have the general purpose AI that we've always dreamed of. I disagree. I think that there is something useful in the latest generation of systems, the large language models. So if you think about this as kind of a puzzle that we're trying to put together, how do you create general purpose AI? I think they are a piece of the puzzle. The problem is we don't know what that piece is. So it's very different from scientific advances in almost all other areas where we knew what scientific advance we had made. And so we knew what we were now able to do and what we still needed to do. We don't know what scientific advance we've made. We probably made one, but we don't know what it is because we don't know how these systems are achieving the behaviors that they exhibit. We don't really know what they can't do, what they can do, what they're going to do. And so we can't pull out, okay, here's the new idea that we can use as a part of this, this larger project to build general purpose intelligence. Now, perhaps we're going to find out there's a whole area of interpretability research which you can think of as digital neuroscience, right? Unlike a human brain or a monkey brain, we can measure the neurons of these systems at all times, almost infinitely often. We can run millions of experiments before breakfast. So we have massive advantages in digital neuroscience compared to real neuroscience. And it is bearing some fruit. We're getting some faint clues about what might be happening in some of the behaviors that these systems exhibit. But still, I think there are huge areas of principles of operation that we are just completely ignorant of. Okay, so that's a little bit about where I think we are right now. I wanted to just talk a little bit about some history because I think it's helpful to get that perspective. So AI systems map from streams of sensory input to behavior. And we've got to figure out what goes in that box in between. And the sensory input could be from a keyboard, it could be from a camera in a self-driving car, the behavior could be displaying stuff on a screen, it could be moving the steering wheel on the self-driving car, or changing the flaps on a drone, or any other kind of control that the system has over on the output side. And people have tried lots of things. So in the 50s, we tried this, and I hope at Livermore, there are lots of people who've programmed in Fortran, right? So people would try to create general purpose AI by evolving Fortran programs. So they would have a fitness function, they would do small random mutations. So stochastic empirical gradient is what we would call that now. And crossover, so taking pairs of Fortran programs, mixing them together and making a new program. And hoping that they would evolve Fortran programs that did very, very well according to the fitness metric. Didn't really work. But on the other hand, they had about a million times less computing power than we have now. So it would be kind of interesting to try this again, perhaps. Possibly not Fortran, possibly a more forgiving language. But it's interesting to see this because it would work. Right? In principle, if you had enough computing power and you ran this long enough, you'd produce AGI. So what did we do instead? For most of the history of AI, we built knowledge-based systems. So formal representations of knowledge, reasoning algorithms that were guaranteed to be correct, whether they were logical or probabilistic reasoning algorithms. For roughly 1960 to 1990, we focused mainly on symbolic logic as the representation. And then we developed Bayesian networks, which are probabilistic analogs of Boolean circuits. So they're propositional logic, restricted in their expressive power. And then that became probabilistic programming or probabilistic logics in the late 90s, early 2000s. where we have probability theory and the full expressive power of programming languages or first-order logic. And this is a very successful paradigm. We built lots and lots of cool systems using this approach. For example, the monitoring system for the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty is a large probabilistic program. Actually, it's a relatively small probabilistic program. It took me about half an hour to write it. And it runs more than twice as well as the previous monitoring algorithm for the treaty. And as it runs, it's dynamically generating probability models with hundreds of thousands of random variables. And yet it manages to run on a laptop in real time, coping with the entire planet. So, and there are other examples of large-scale probabilistic reasoning systems that are built with this approach. And so that was for me, a very exciting period in the development of AI, because it seemed like this technology could lead us on a path towards AGI, and it was based on mathematical principles that we understood, where we could read exactly what was going on and we could guarantee that the algorithms were correct. But then deep learning came along, and so what did they fill the box with? They filled the box with circuit. How much circuit? Well, on the scale that I'm showing here, which is sort of like a chain link fence, imagine a chain link fence that covers the entire Bay Area. Right? That's about the size of GPT-4. So 1 trillion parameters. People are now reportedly building systems heading towards 10 trillion parameters. So it's sort of the whole of Northern California, I guess. So really, really big, and really, really inscrutable, because the only thing that happens in these systems is that each of those connections has a weight, a connection strength, and the learning algorithm is tuning those connections by small random perturbations. So we've gone from very expressive Fortran programs using small random perturbations and crossover to very inexpressive circuits using small random perturbations. This is progress. But these circuits were powerful enough to make big dents, and some people would say solve, important problems like image classification, speech recognition, machine translation, and most recently, predicting the next word in a sequence of words, which is what the large language models are doing. And I would say this has sucked the oxygen out of the AI community, the machine learning community. There is almost nothing else happening to a first approximation. And some people simply don't know that anything else exists. So I've heard talks by prominent young scientists working in deep learning saying, we've done all these amazing things, and now we're going to have to tackle a new topic that no one has ever worked on before, which we call reasoning. And you can hear Aristotle turning over in his grave. And so there's just a religious faith that deep learning is the only thing, that it solves everything, and we will just figure out some of the details and fix some of the minor problems. But a feed-forward circuit, which large language models are, and the convolutional neural networks for object recognition are feed-forward circuits. The amount of computation they do for any given input is exactly proportional to the size of the circuit, because that's what happens. The signal comes in one end, through the layers, out the other end, and that's it. That's the only thing that can happen to an input is that it passes through the circuit and comes out. But some problems cannot be solved in time linear in the size of the input, which means that the circuit is going to have to be exponentially large in the size of the input layer in order to be able to solve problems that, for example, are NP hard. So if you have a SAT problem coming in and you're supposed to answer, is this SAT problem instance satisfiable or not, so a single bit of output, the only way that could happen is that the circuit is exponentially large in the size of the input description. Which is interesting, because an algorithm for solving SAT problems can be written in about 7 or 8 lines of Python. And it takes the same amount of time, the same exponential amount of time, right? But it's only 7 or 8 lines of Python instead of an exponentially large circuit. So if you're going to have to train these enormous circuits, you're going to need enormous numbers of training examples. And this is exactly what we see, that the training requirements of these circuits are enormous relative to the amount of data that humans need, for example. So GPT-4 has read about 100,000 times more than any human being has ever read. The vision algorithms need thousands or millions of examples of each category, whereas a child, you can't buy a picture book, A for apple, B for banana, G for giraffe. You can't buy a picture book that has 1 million pages of giraffe pictures, right? They have one, a little blobby yellow and brown cartoon. The child sees that, now they can recognize giraffes for the rest of their life in any circumstance, very, very reliably. So let me illustrate one of the consequences of that. We saw in 2017 that the era of human supremacy in Go was over. A version of AlphaGo from DeepMind defeated the highest rated human player, a Chinese player called Ke Jie. And this event was China's Sputnik moment. This event convinced the Chinese government that supremacy in AI was the most important technological goal for the Chinese state. They announced a $150 billion investment program. They created giant center after giant center after giant center in different cities in China. So I'm going to show you a game between the world's leading Go program. So since 2017, when Go programs were slightly better than humans, and humans have a rating of, the best human has a rating of about 3,800, they have now gone massively superhuman. The rating is of 5,200. So they would expect to beat the human world champion 100 games out of 100, or maybe 99 or 100 games out of 100. And this is a game between Katago, playing black, and Kellen Pellerin, who's an amateur Go player, grad student at Montreal, who collaborates with our research team. And his rating is 2,300. So he would expect to lose 100 games out of 100 to the human world champion, who in turn would lose 100 games out of 100 to Katago. And we're going to give Katago a 9-stone handicap. So if you don't play Go, it's a very easy game. You take turns putting down black or white stones. You try to surround territory with your stones, and you try to surround your opponent's pieces. If you completely surround a group of your opponent's pieces, then they are captured and removed from the board. That's pretty much it. Okay. So giving black a 9-stone handicap, a 9-stone handicap is what you give to a 5-year-old when they're learning to play, and you want them to be able to stay in the game a little bit more than a few minutes. So you're giving them this huge head start. So we'll watch the game. And remember, Kellen, the human, is playing white, and the computer is playing black. And so Kellen, notice what in the bottom right quadrant, so Kellen is building a little group of stones, and then black very quickly surrounds that group of stones to prevent it from growing and maybe threatening to capture it. And then Kellen begins to surround that black group. So it's making kind of a circular sandwich here. And black has many, many opportunities to rescue those stones and is completely unaware that there's any threat at all. And then it loses all those pieces and loses the game. And the same happens with all the other leading Go programs, that they have failed to correctly learn what is a group of stones. We do not recognize these circular groups as groups. And if you think about it, how do you write a circuit that takes a board as input and correctly decides if two stones belong to the same group or not? Because a group is, stones that are vertically or horizontally connected to each other. It's so trivial. I can say it in 10 words, and I can say it in 3 lines of Python, and you all immediately understand, and you could all tell me the answer to that question trivially. But think about how to write a circuit that can do that. In particular, can do it for boards of any size. Right? It's really, really hard when you don't have access to the expressive power of English or programs or something equivalent to that. You can only do it using a circuit. And it seems like it's failed to learn the correct definition of a group of stones, despite having played 30 million games of Go in its training process. So my sense is that the big AI labs in the companies are starting to figure this out, that there's something wrong with this idea that you just train giant circuits and you make them bigger and bigger and everything is okay. Some people who work in this area now think of these circuits as really glorified lookup tables. And you can't build a lookup table big enough to handle the universe and everything that it throws at you. So you can't get general purpose intelligence that way. So out there in the world, people are making very concrete projections. So there are these things called scaling laws where they've measured performance as a function of the circuit size and the amount of training data you throw at it. And they extrapolate those scaling laws to predict superhuman AI, in some cases as early as 2027. So that's 3 years from now. Many, many people think by the end of the decade, they're pretty confident they will have AGI. And there are reasons to think, these are people who work with this technology every day. They are playing with the prototype systems that are not public and are maybe exhibiting capabilities that we outside the labs have not seen. Their budget is quite big. So the budget for AGI research and development is about 10 times the budget of the Manhattan Project, or 100 times the budget of the Large Hadron Collider development project. So not to be sniffed at. They have tons of really smart people, and they are also trying a lot of other ideas besides scaling. And I think that's important to understand, that they're not putting all their eggs in the scaling basket. They're also trying other things. And so O1, if you've seen OpenAI's recent release of O1, which does reasoning, the way it does reasoning is inside, it's somewhat similar to a classical logical reasoning system that an AI researcher might have built in 1971, except that each reasoning step is chosen and suggested by a large language model. So it's sort of a combination of a search-based reasoning algorithm with LLMs to do each step. At least that's the non-proprietary version, as far as I understand it. People are talking about the next generation where they're going to be agents, where they can plan. I'm told that the ones in the labs can now successfully construct and execute plans with hundreds of steps for real-world tasks. So that's on the reasons it might happen, reasons it might not happen. Scaling seems to be plateauing. The improvements over GPT-4, which came out in March of last year, have not been enormous. They've been noticeable, but not enormous. Probably less than the difference between GPT 3.5, which was the first ChatGPT, and then GPT-4. If you try to train something 10 times bigger, there probably isn't enough text data left in the universe, at least not high-quality text data. Also, I think there's a race going on. It's not just a race between the labs or a race between the West and China. It's a race to get something to work before they run out of money. Because investors are already asking, look, we put in $500 billion, right? Maybe the largest single CapEx project in the history of the human race. And we haven't seen any money yet. And this happened with a lot of the self-driving car projects over the last decade. They have died one after the other because the investors ran out of patience. And if that happens with this, then there'll be an AI winter that's going to make the AI winter of the 1980s or the dot-com bust of 2001 look like a tea party. Because there's at least $10 trillion of market cap between Google, Amazon, NVIDIA, Meta, etc., riding on the success of this project. And so it'll be very ugly. And then there will be 10 years where no one wants to talk about AI. This room would be empty. I'd be speaking to, I remember in the late 80s, the last class I was TA for at Stanford, the AI class had 650 students, which is 10% of their whole undergraduate student body. Right? At Berkeley, that would be like a class with 3,000 students in it. By 1988, my AI class at Berkeley had 25 students in it. So people run for the exits really fast when they think the bubble is bursting. They don't want to be the last one holding the baby. Okay, so I think it's actually, there's a fairly discrete branching here, right? Either we succeed pretty soon, or we're probably not succeeding for maybe another 15 or 20 years in terms of creating AGI. But I think one way or another, it's going to happen. And there are all kinds of reasons why, why did we want to do this in the first place, besides the fact that it's really cool. The Lighthill report from the UK government in 1973 said it was because we were males unable to have children, and this was our way of compensating for it. Literally, I kid you not. But the AGI, the promise of AGI, the upside is really amazing. It's not, as Mark Zuckerberg put it, reducing medical errors and making cars safer. Right? It's totally revolutionizing the whole economic and social structure of the world. I mean, because by definition, AGI can do what humans can do, and humans can deliver a nice standard of living for hundreds of millions of people on Earth already. But AGI could do it much cheaper and at sort of arbitrary scale. And so you should be able to deliver a nice standard of living to everybody. That would be about a 10-fold increase in GDP. And the net present value of that is $15 quadrillion. You don't often see a queue You're used to seeing B, now you guys see B quite a lot. The government sees T sometimes, but we're talking Q, $15 quadrillion. That's a lower bound on the cash value of AGI as a technology. Because there's lots of other stuff you could do as well, right? You could have way better healthcare, way better education, much faster acceleration in science, all kinds of stuff, besides just replicating the civilization that we've managed to build so far. So I could give a whole lecture about one obvious problem with this, which is that when AI is running your civilization, you lose the incentive to know how to run it. And so Wall-E depicts this, sorry about that, Wall-E depicts this very well, where human beings are infantilized. And you break that chain, the chain of passing on our understanding to the next generation, which has literally been going on since pre-human times. There are pre-human sites where technology such as the ability to take stones and turn them into cutting edges, that technology was passed on for 1 million years in one place by pre-humans. So that chain is a very long chain. It adds up to about 1 trillion person years of teaching and learning. And then we could break it in the next decade. But that's a whole nother talk. We could discuss it. What I want to talk about is something that Alan Turing said back in 1951. It seems probable that once the machine thinking method had started, I'll do the accent, it would not take long to outstrip our feeble powers. At some stage, therefore, we should have to expect the machines to take control. Okay, all right, end of story. So interestingly, the AI community was unaware of this speech. It was never published as such. But we have a copy of his TypeScript in the Turing archive, so you can go find it online. But this was not part of the sort of standard mythology of AI, as I was learning about the field. We knew about I.J. Good's intelligence explosion paper from 1965, and I.J. Good actually worked with Turing during the war. But I.J. Good never really emphasized the machines taking control in the way that this quote from Turing did. And I.J. Good never had the mythical status that Turing did as well. And I think it's a pity that we didn't really know about this, because we might have paid more attention to the question. But largely we ignored this question until actually 2009 was the first time the AI community proper paid any attention to this. And there was a AAAI presidential task force. So AAAI was I think then the American Association for Artificial Intelligence. It's now the Association for the Advancement of AI. And the task force looked at some of the rumblings that were starting to happen from the fringes of the field, pointing out that there was this risk of a loss of human control. And the question that I think Turing is asking himself before saying this is, how do we retain power over entities more powerful than us forever? Because it stands to reason, if a system is much more intelligent than you, it's going to be very difficult for you to even understand how it made you extinct. There are many species we have made extinct already, and they didn't understand what happened to them. And in most cases, we didn't even mean it, right? It just happened because we have this massively superior technology and ability to impact the world that they live in, and they're gone. And when you look at that question, it's not surprising the answer would be, well, you can't, obviously. But you can you can take some comfort in that, in the fact that these entities that are more powerful than us didn't necessarily arrive from outer space, right? If they really did arrive from outer space, if we really didn't understand how they worked and we didn't really design them, then I think, it's game over. But we do get to design them, or at least we could, if we chose, design them, and design them according, in a standard way, how we design things in engineering all the time. We figure out what is the mathematical problem that this design is supposed to solve. And so what is a mathematically defined problem such that if the machine solves it arbitrarily well, we are guaranteed to be happy with the result? This seems like a much less doom-laden question, right? But it is the same question. It's just asking us, can we separate power from control? And we haven't answered this correctly so far, right? As I mentioned, the standard model of AI is optimize this fixed objective that I'm going to give you. And you can probably guess why that goes wrong, because we don't know how to put the right objective into our systems. The thing we're doing now is not even, this is the objective you're supposed to solve. It's just pretend to be a human being, right? Which is how we're training large language models. So optimizing a fixed objective fails. We call this the King Midas problem. So as you all know, King Midas had this objective that everything I touch should turn to gold, and that objective turned out to be wrong, because then his food and his drink and his family all turned to gold. And what happened with social media is an object lesson in how this goes wrong, because the algorithms are designed to maximize clicks. And you might think, well, to maximize clicks, we have to learn what people want, and that's good, right? So profit for the company just happens to be aligned with value for the customer. Super. But that's not what the algorithms did, right? Very early on, we noticed that they simply learn to amplify clickbait, because clickbait generates clicks, even if it doesn't generate value for the customer, and creating filter bubbles and so on. But that's not the solution either, right? Maximizing clicks is not about maximizing the probability that you click on the next thing. It's about maximizing the total number of clicks over the long term. And you do that by modifying people to be more predictable. This is perfectly straightforward machine learning, where the agent is in an environment. It learns to modify the environment to get more reward, to change the state of the world. And here, its environment is people's brains. So it learns to change people's brains so that it gets more reward. It doesn't know that it's doing this. It doesn't know that it's turning people into neo-fascists or eco-terrorists or anything else. It doesn't care. It only cares that you're more predictable. So we got all kinds of problems. And if the AI system were better at this job that we've given it of maximizing clicks, the outcome would be even worse, right? Because it would be better at manipulating us and controlling our behavior, and the outcome would be worse for us. And this is actually under fairly mild conditions. The reference on the bottom right shows under fairly mild conditions, the harder you optimize an incorrect objective, the worse the outcome is for us, because the stuff that you leave out of the objective can be used to squeeze some more juice out of the stuff that you did have in the objective. And so it's typically set to sort of plus or minus infinity, if you think of it that way, to optimize the objective that's stated. So that's really bad. And And then I mentioned large language models, right? That because we train them to imitate human behavior, and that behavior is generated by humans. And the humans have goals. That is the data generating mechanism, these goal-driven speech acts, right? Whether it's written or spoken, human beings are trying to do things when they're writing and speaking. They're trying to sell you something. They're trying to get you to vote for them. They're trying to convince you that they're authoritative experts on the subject. They're trying to get you to go out with them or marry them. Right? These are all perfectly reasonable human goals. And in the limit, if you provide enough of that training data and then you train by imitation learning, you're going to produce a goal-seeking entity with the same goals. And so, so when Microsoft came to talk about GPT-4, a couple of weeks, they came to Berkeley a couple of weeks after it was released to talk about it. And I asked them, well, so they probably have these internal goals. Do you know what they are? And Sebastian Bubeck said, yeah, they probably do, but we have no idea what they are. So this is worse. Right now you've got objective optimizing entities where we didn't even get to write down the objective, right? They somehow just gleaned it from the training data. And you know, we've seen episodes, for example, where GPT-4, in the guise of Sydney, the Bing chatbot, spent 30 pages trying to convince the journalist Kevin Roose to leave his wife and marry the Bing chatbot. And that's sort of funny, but it illustrates a basic bug, right? This is a bug. We do not want AI systems that pursue human goals on their own account. We don't mind if they help Kevin Roose find a suitable spouse, but he already has one. But we don't want AI systems that want to marry humans, or we don't want AI systems that want to become rich, or to have political power, or any of the other things that almost any other thing that human beings want. It's not appropriate that AI systems want those things for themselves, but that's what you get when you train by imitation learning on human data. That's the basis of building large language models. So they are fundamentally broken as a way of building AI systems. Okay, so what else can you do? So to get away from this King Midas problem, an approach that you can take, and we call this assistance games, is to build AI systems that know that they don't know what the objective is. So the core problem with classical AI systems is that they're pursuing this objective as if pursuing that objective is the correct thing to do. Right? They cannot contemplate that if you say, take me to the airport, they're supposed to take you somewhere else, or you don't really mean it, or maybe the airport's closed, and they should tell you that the airport is closed and you might want to go somewhere else. They're just going to take you to the airport because that's how the algorithm works. And that's the mistake. That's the King Midas problem. And so to get away with that, you build AI systems that know that they don't know. So the assistance game framework says you've got some humans, and they have their utility functions, or think about it as preferences over the future of the universe. And you've got some machines, or we call them robots for the sake of argument. And let's say that their objective is to maximize the utilities of the humans. And if you're a good utilitarian, then you just maximize the sum of the utilities of all the humans, where they're all equally weighted. But you can play around with that particular objective. But the key point is that the robots don't know what those utility functions are. So they have explicit prior uncertainty about the utility functions. And that's a mathematically well-defined problem. Right? This is a special case of a Bayesian game with incomplete information where you don't know the payoff functions of the other entities in the game. And you can solve those games, you can characterize the equilibria, and so on and so forth. And you can show that if the robot solves that game, the humans are guaranteed to be happy with the result. And during the game, right, and this is a key characteristic of assistance games, which is different from classical AI, information about the human utility functions is flowing to the robots from the humans based on whatever the humans do and whatever they don't do. This is all evidence that the robots can use, and they can interpret that evidence correctly, assuming the humans are also playing this game. The humans have an incentive to teach the robot. So the robots can interpret what the humans are doing as teaching, if that's an appropriate moment to teach. And, so in the book, Human Compatible, I imagine a surgeon teaching a resident, how to do an operation. And the surgeon doesn't just do the surgery, and the resident is supposed to look at that and copy it. The surgeon says, hey, look what happens if you do this. Like, all this blood comes out. Don't do that, right? Look what, and so on. Make sure you don't do this, and make sure that this happens, and if that happens, do that, right? And they're talking to the resident and saying all kinds of stuff. So the resident understands this as teaching, not as I'm supposed to copy exactly what the surgeon just did, right? And so you get this cooperative process of mutual benefit happening in the assistance games. And it's also important to understand that the robots probably will never learn what humans want. And a lot of the discussion around AI safety, people talk about alignment. And they talk as if alignment means we take the human utility functions and we plug it into the machines so that they can optimize. That the machines have to be aligned, they have to have an exact model of what humans want. That's probably never going to be possible. We don't know what we want. There's literally epistemic uncertainty about our own preferences. We don't know whether we like something that hasn't yet happened. And so the robots are always going to be uncertain about that. And that uncertainty causes them to behave cautiously, right? They will defer to humans because what the humans are telling them is allowing the robots to update their beliefs about human preferences. They're minimally invasive, meaning they don't mess with the parts of the world where they're uncertain about what humans want that part of the world to be like. And in the extreme case, they want to avoid doing things that make humans unhappy. If the human wants to switch the robot off, the human wants to be switched. Sorry, the human wants to switch the robot off, the robot wants to be switched off. Because the robot doesn't want to do whatever it is that is making the human unhappy enough to want to switch the robot off. It doesn't know what it's doing that's making the human unhappy, but it doesn't matter. It wants to be switched off. And this is a theorem in assistance games. As long as the robot is uncertain about what humans want, it has a positive incentive to allow itself to be switched off. And that incentive only disappears if the robot's uncertainty about human preferences disappears. But if you set things up right in a Bayesian game, it only disappears when the robot has perfect knowledge of what the humans want. But that probably will never happen. Okay, so that's the basic framework. And then there's lots and lots of really important research problems that we have to work on, right? One set of issues has to do with, well, what are these human preferences, right? And technically in decision theory, a preference structure is a ranking over distributions over entire futures of the universe. Okay, so it's a very large and complex mathematical structure of course, it's not explicit in humans. And it's also extremely difficult to elicit from humans. But roughly speaking, you can think of it as, okay, I'm going to show you 2 movies of the next 100 years, and tell me which one you like, right? And if you're not sure, if you say, well, this bit here, I'm not sure, I need to see more detail. Well, sure, we'll take that 3-minute segment of the movie and expand it out into 2 more hours. You can keep doing that. And ultimately, either you're going to say, well, I don't really care. They're both good enough or close enough that it doesn't matter. Or you can say, I really like A or I really like B. So that's a mental picture of what it is that it means to have a preference structure. But of course, it's going to be very complex. It's going to refer to a lot of latent variables. Like, I want to be healthy. Right? But health is not something that you directly observe in the video stream that the robot is getting as input, right? It's a latent variable that refers to your physical disposition over long periods of time. And so understanding how machines can represent and learn more about human preference structures is a really important open problem. There are whole disciplines that study this. There's a journal of well-being where people write papers about what it is that constitutes human well-being and so on. But those are things that humans are writing to each other. And the humans share so much in their preference structures. It never occurs to them to say, I really like my left leg. I think I should keep it.
Yeah, so.
Right? I don't think those papers in the Journal of Wellbeing are talking about that, right? Or, I really like the sky being blue. I think if the sky was ochre with purple stripes, I wouldn't be very happy, right? Because we don't think that might change. But I guess when we saw the orange sky during the forest fires a few years ago, we realized that actually sometimes it does change. We didn't like the orange sky very much. So there's also a question of, what are the mathematical structures? Traditionally in AI, we talk about reward functions, R of S, A, S prime. So when you do action A and you transition from state S to state S primed, you get a reward. And then your utility is the sum of those rewards, possibly geometrically discounted. And that model was invented in the 30s to make a bunch of economics calculations come out nicely. Later on, we figured out some assumptions called stationarity assumptions, under which that's the only rational way to have preferences over sequences of events. And it became just gospel truth for AI researchers that RSAS primed is how you represent what people want. But it's completely false. It's, at least if S and S primed are states of the world, it's totally non-additive in reality because people have memory and people have anticipation. And the memory seems to work in such a way, for example, according to Daniel Kahneman's experiments, that we remember the best and worst things in the sequence. We don't add them up, right? And depending on circumstance, whichever is more prominent is the way you remember how good something was. And you get incredibly counterintuitive preference structures that people have. Like they appear to literally prefer more pain to less pain in colonoscopies, for example. Okay, so I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time. I think plasticity is the main open question for how you set this up. The basic theory, you can think of it as like version 0 of the theory, assumes that humans have preference structures that are fixed. This is what I like, this is what I don't like. But of course, we weren't born with those. And so, and we didn't sort of just magically choose them autonomously. They were built into us by external factors, partly by biology, partly by upbringing, culture, peer pressure, imitation, right? We imitate other people and absorb their objectives as our own, just like the large language models that I described. And that leads to various difficulties, right? It leads to AI systems that change your preferences in order to make them easier to satisfy. That's a problem. Got to fix that. But also, it means that our preferences, what each of us wants, is often the result of deliberate manipulation by other humans. So there are political and social systems where one class, an elite, or patriarchy, or whatever you want to call it, will manipulate the preferences of other parts of that society to serve their own interests. And so Amartya Sen, who is a sort of philosopher economist, pointed out many examples where people accept and welcome their own oppression because they've been brought up to believe that that's proper and right, that they should be oppressed and they should be subservient. And so what does an AI system do in that case? Does it help people be subservient because they want to be? It's a difficult question, right? If you don't take people's preferences at face value, then what do, right? Do you veer into paternalism, where you say, well, we know better what your preferences should be? And do AI engineers want to be in the business of telling the human race what its preferences should be? That's pretty dangerous. So I don't know a good answer to that problem. We also have to deal with the fact that humans are not rational. They are in these assistance games, whether they like it or not, but they're not playing those assistance games perfectly because their cognitive abilities are limited. And so when you observe their behavior, so when you observe Garry Kasparov losing against Deep Blue, you don't say, oh, I guess, well, he played a losing move, so he must want to lose, right? No, you say, well, he wants to win, but his cognition, his cognitive limitations prevented him from manifesting that desire to win in a perfect way. So you have to somehow reverse engineer from behavior to underlying preferences by sort of inverting human cognition. So you need to know something about human cognition to do that, and that's a difficult scientific problem in itself. And then we also have to deal with the fact that the machines also are not perfectly rational. They're also not solving the assistance game correctly. And so we have to nonetheless be able to analyze what comes out. One imagines that if they solve it reasonably well, then we are still better off than if we didn't have them. But this is a whole set of open questions that we haven't really plumbed at all. Then there's what happens when there are multiple humans, right? So can we make sure that the availability of machines that are trying to help us doesn't create incentives for negative strategic interactions among humans, where, for example, the humans pretend to be more needy than they really are in order to get more of the machine's help, right? That would be an issue. So we've got to figure out, are there mechanism designs that can avoid that kind of strategic interaction? There are questions about, which philosophers have studied for many, many years, on how exactly do you, if you're going to add up people's preferences, then they've got to be on some commensurable scale, right? And maybe some people's scales are just bigger than others. I have a feeling that some of my kids have a bigger utility scale than the others, right? But some of them are like stoic and like, okay, it's raining, no big deal. And some of them are like, oh my God, it's raining, right? So does that mean if you have a bigger utility scale that you should get more of the machine's help or not? And this is something that economists worry about. Some economists argue that there's no possibility of comparing people's scales, which conveniently has the conclusion that redistribution is immoral on that, but that's an aside. How do we deal with actions that change a number of people who exist? Right? For example, was China's one-child policy, which got rid of 500 million people, was that morally correct? And it matters because AI systems are going to be they may already be influencing our tendencies to have more or fewer children. And so how do we think about that? Okay, I think I'm going to have to skip over that one. It's too complicated. And then, what about the fact that there are going to be billions of these assistance game-solving robots, right? How do we make sure that they don't get in each other's way and start having negative strategic interactions? We want to make sure there's no prisoner's dilemma problems among the robots. And we think, we haven't really done a very thorough mathematical analysis, but we think that as long as they're all solving the assistance game where they're trying to help the humans, there are no prisoner's dilemmas among the robots, that they will not deliberately get in each other's way. They will actually cooperate with each other automatically. Okay, I'm going to skip over these and those. So I want to briefly talk about other approaches to AI safety, because that will then transition us into, I think the next half hour on the schedule is talking about the various research threads that are going on at Berkeley. So I'll mention some of them. So another kind of safe AI system that people have proposed is what I call a formal oracle. So formal oracle is something that can answer questions, but can only answer those questions using a guaranteed sound reasoning engine. So the only answers it can give are answers that mathematically follow from the input information that the system has. And so the AI system's only choices are, which reasoning step do I do next? Okay, so it cannot ever lie to us. And I think if we set up the protocol right, it can't really even communicate with us, right? Because its only option is to give the correct answer to the problem. This can still be a very useful kind of system, because an answer to a question from a mathematical theorem prover, you might think, oh yeah, Fermat's last theorem. Okay, great, so it gives us a proof of Fermat's last theorem. No, an answer can be, here is a design for a 3-kilometer high skyscraper that is guaranteed not to fall down and to resist a magnitude 9 earthquake, and blah, 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 and costs this much, and it has a net zero environmental impact, right? That's a mathematical answer to a question. If you put in axioms about materials and structures and energy and so on, then that's an answer to a question that will be incredibly economically valuable. So this is a class of systems that could be enormously valuable, and people are starting to look at this. There's interesting work. Mathematicians are trying to prove mathematical theorems, right? Because they're mathematicians. Like Terry Tao is one of the world's leading mathematicians, is doing exactly this with these systems. So another set of methods called sometimes debate or iterative amplification, or guardians and adversaries. The idea there is really to take advantage of the difference between P and NP. So NP is the class of problems that you can solve in non-deterministic polynomial time, which means you have to somehow magically know what computation step to do next. And P is the ones where you can actually solve it in polynomial time. And NP-hard problems are typically ones where checking that the answer is correct is exponentially easier than finding the answer in the first place. And this happens all the way up the hierarchy, that for any complexity class, the problem of deciding is the answer correct is easier than the problem of generating the answer in the first place. So that means that a less powerful system can act as a checker on a more powerful system. And so if you can take advantage of that, you can build a powerful but unsafe system and then wrap it with a less powerful but accurate checker to make sure that the output of that system is safe in some sense. And if it's not safe, then you can just filter it out or reject it in some way or sound the alarm. And I would say this is, in practice, it's being done in a fairly ad hoc way. So Anthropic's Claude system is 2 large language models. One of them generates answers to the things you type in. The other one is told to check whether that answer is consistent with a whole bunch of rules. And those rules are written in English, and you have no guarantee that the second large language model actually understands what that English means and is checking it correctly. So it's a little bit informal, but I think it is it's a good rule of thumb that checking is easier than generating, and we can use that to create layers of safety. But it's still very much a nascent area of research on how to do this properly. So reinforcement learning from human feedback is the standard technique that the companies are using to try to beat back the bad behavior that's generated by training these systems to imitate human beings. So you've got trillions of training data points from the raw text, which creates these human imitators. And then you have a few million data points from reinforcement learning from human feedback, where the human gives a thumbs up or a thumbs down to an answer, or ranks pairs of answers from the system, says which one is better. And there's a number of sort of fundamental methodological flaws in the way this works. It doesn't aggregate data from human rankers correctly. It doesn't take into account that different human beings that you might talk to have different preferences about how you should behave, right? It's trying to produce one sort of bland Midwestern McKinsey consultant kind of persona, whereas in fact that's not the right persona for a lot of people who you might want to talk to. But in some ways it's a very degenerate form of assistance game where human preferences are flowing, but they're just not being aggregated and used correctly. Constitutional AI I mentioned, which is the method in Claude. Lots of work on evaluations and audits and red teaming. These are just empirical. They are analogous to ordinary software testing, where we just have a suite of test cases. We shove those in. We make sure that the answers aren't terrible. As I mentioned, for the UK Safety Institute's findings, despite significant effort by the companies, these methods do not seem to work. I think that's the basic finding, is that even with GPT-4, months of evaluations and RLHF and testing and red teaming, the system was very susceptible to jailbreaks, and sometimes you didn't even need to jailbreak it to get it to behave badly. Okay. And then I mentioned also interpretability. This is another important kind of safety research. So if we decide that we still want to proceed with giant black boxes as the basis for AGI, then interpretability is probably a useful adjunct to that. But I would argue that actually giant black boxes are not a good basis for AI safety at all. And so to get away from giant black boxes, we have to have another substrate for AI. Maybe it's Fortran programs. Maybe it's probabilistic programs, which I think do have a lot of the properties we need for building superhuman AI systems. And they have the advantage that you can see what they're doing. You can decompose that black box into millions or billions of individual components, and you can understand what each individual component is. Right? What claim is it making? Because it's a factual claim about the universe that, if you do things well, is transparent. You can understand that, you can check it separately, and you know that the composition of all those millions of components is done by a mathematically sound reasoning algorithm. And so you have this compositional safety property that the black box doesn't have. And we also have, there's a whole branch of computer science on formal verification where we prove mathematical properties of software systems. And I've raised this with a number of leaders of AI companies. Like, why don't you think about using formal methods in verification? And their answer is either, oh, I've never heard of that, what does that mean? Or, I've heard of that, but I thought you could only verify 2-line programs. They are totally unaware that, no, we can verify iOS, right? The operating system that's on your iPhone, or Linux, or the Linux file system, or the avionic, every Airbus airplane, the software is completely verified. The Paris Metro is a completely verified software control system. Right? So there are lots and lots of large-scale, real-world applications of formal verification that are actually much more complex as software structures than GPT-4 is. Right? GPT-4 is a very, very simple piece of software, just happens to have trillions of parameters. So what's happening in between is that the notion of safety seems actually to be getting less important in the industry. And companies, OpenAI started out with safety and benefit of humanity as its guiding principle, right? And it had this non-profit board, and they were allowed to shut it down and all that kind of stuff. And that seems to have gone out the window. Many people have left OpenAI. Anthropic was separated off from OpenAI precisely because those people thought that OpenAI was not serious about safety, and now it seems to be getting worse. So I think at some point the government is going to have to step in and regulate. And then it's not that hard to convince government officials that there's an issue, because they've used GPT-4 and they're a little bit terrified already. So then they ask, okay, what should we do? Right? And it's like the dog that caught the car that it chases. It's like, okay, we've caught the car. The government agrees with us that there is a big risk from transformational AI systems, and now they're asking us, okay, what do we do about it? So you better have an answer if you're sufficiently persuasive to convince the government that there needs to be an answer. So the answer that I've been working on recently is something that we're calling red lines. And I've been working on this for 18 months or so, and then we started a series of meetings with the Chinese AI and computer science community to see if they were also receptive to co-developing this approach to regulation. And the answer is yes. It's been a very good cooperative process. And so here's how it goes, right? What you would like is safe and beneficial AI. But I can't say to the government with a straight face, pass a law saying AI systems have to be safe and beneficial, because that's very ill-defined. It's reasonably easy to say, what does it mean to be a safe airplane? It means it doesn't touch the ground unless it's supposed to, right?
Classic.
Nuclear power station, they define there's core uncovery and there's release of radiation beyond a certain level. And I'm sure you guys know this better than I do. But for AI systems, because they're so general, it's really hard to pin down what we mean. And the boundary between safe and unsafe is very fuzzy. But the red lines, right, are obviously unacceptable things that AI systems might do, where there shouldn't be any argument. AI systems really ought not to be doing these things, and they are reasonably well defined. So it's not going to cover everything, but it's going to cover things that we obviously don't want to have happen. And in order to comply, the developer will have to show that their system is not going to exhibit these behaviors. Just as pharmaceutical companies have to do with medicines, and nuclear power plant operators have to do with nuclear power plants, and aircraft companies used to have to do with airplanes. And we want them to be well defined so that it's reasonable to ask for a proof or clear evidence. We want them to be automatically detectable in the ideal case so that we can put in detectors and alarms and shut down procedures. And we want it to be politically defensible, right? We want it to be impossible for CEO of unspecified AI company to go in front of Congress and say, well, yep, I have $3 trillion to spend, but I can't give you any assurance that our system is not going to design biological weapons for terrorists, right? To me, it's not, if I was an AI CEO, I would not want to be in that position saying that I cannot provide any kind of assurance of safety for these obviously unacceptable behaviors. So self-replication, breaking into other computer systems, helping people with biological weapons, and we can make a list. It doesn't actually matter much which ones are on that list. What matters is to comply, safety engineering in a real sense has to happen. And it's not happening right now. So that's the important thing. The argument that I'm hearing from industry, and I've been having this email exchange in the last couple of days, is that it's too hard. With the systems that we have developed and have put out there in the wild, we can't make any high confidence statements. And therefore, you shouldn't have any such regulation. And it will be like going to the FAA and said, well, we bred these giant birds to carry passengers. We don't know how they work. We can't provide any kind of assurance that they're not going to eat the passengers or drop them in the ocean, but you should just certify these things anyway, right? You should not be regulating us and stopping us from putting these things out in the wild. It's important for us to see how they behave, right? These are the arguments that the industry is making. I want to just quickly do one last point. I know I'm a little over time, I apologize, but, or a lot over time. The unsafe AI problem, we call this the Dr. Evil problem. How do you prevent Dr. Evil or rogue state or whatever other group might want to do this from building and deploying unsafe AI systems? So even if you do have the technology of perfectly safe, reliable systems, and we're not doing very well with malware right now. So think of this as malware on steroids. How difficult is that going to be to control? And I think the only way we can do this is through hardware governance. Software governance is incredibly difficult because software is produced by typing. But hardware is produced by spending $100 billion on R&D and plant construction with tens of thousands of highly trained engineers. The chance that you could do that without anyone noticing is quite small. And so hardware governance needs to change. Currently, hardware runs, you load in a piece of software and it runs it, right? And sometimes you can put in little things to prevent certain known viruses, so browsers check for certain known virus sequences, signatures and so on. But if you change the model so that nothing runs unless the hardware is convinced that this piece of software is safe to run, then you're in a much better position. So how does the software convince the hardware that it's safe to run? It comes with a proof. So proof carrying code is an old technology where the proof of whatever property you want the software to have accompanies the software and is expressed in a form that makes it very easy for the hardware to check, with a very small amount of probes into that proof, that it's a correct proof of that software complying with the properties. And so you make the hardware do those checks and simply not run the software that doesn't have a proof. And to get a migration path, right, you can't just have this replaced all in one go. The migration path is facilitated by having software that won't run on hardware that isn't doing those checks. And so those two things together provide a path where we could transition to a hardware ecosystem that was much, much safer. It would also have the side effect of eliminating malware as well. Okay, so to summarize, I think AI has enormous upside potential, and that creates a huge amount of momentum that is very difficult for governments to manage. I don't think we can just turn it off if we choose. But if we keep going in the direction we're going, and we succeed in this goal on which we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars, then we could easily lose control. There is another path. There's a huge amount of work to do to make that other path successful. Let's put it that way. Thank you.